company's presentation, Cyber Insurance Decoded. It's strategy for risk management. We are glad that you are with us. We are looking forward to this. A little housekeeping. Those of you who came earlier are going to hear this twice. But everyone is muted as usual in this webinar, but we do encourage you to ask questions on the chat throughout the presentation. We'll try to answer some of those questions as we go, but we will definitely have time at the end for more. We're also going to share a full recording of this in our post-event email, along with some resources we're going to talk about, as well as our cyber insurance checklist, which you actually can find in the handouts right now. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, so we'll remind you. And I think everybody has probably had enough time, so let's get started here. My name is Jennifer Biggs. I'm part of the Exigent technology team, and we're glad to have you here. I'm going to warn you now, we are going to cover a lot of ground today. We are talking with our guest Jim about what cyber insurance is, the different types, picking not just the right coverage, but the right provider. That is enough right there for a webinar. So, there's going to be a lot of fast talking, but we're also going to talk about the tech side of this. So one of the things that often gets overlooked with cyber insurance is that you really have to prepare before you apply. It's not like getting your auto insurance. You're not just rolling in with your car and filling out some forms. They're going to want to know a lot about you before they talk to you about what kind of coverage and really secure you a policy. So we're going to talk about that technology side of preparing and a little bit about just how to approach the whole process. We're also going to look through what a breach incident looks like and talk through what you would expect from partners like your MSP and your cyber insurance provider. One last thing, just a reminder, this is educational. We do not provide insurance. Jim is not even sending us cookies if you guys engage with him. But we really want to take the time to raise awareness of cyber insurance. It is Cybersecurity Awareness Month in October. If you follow us online, you've probably seen blog after blog and social post after social post. But it's really about educating people, letting you know what's going on, and taking some of the gray areas away from this. So I'm your host, but the big brains are these guys. So we have Daniel Hari, who is our president and founder of Exigent. He started this business nearly 30 years ago in New Jersey. He was like 10, so you don't hold that against him. Our roots are in New Jersey. He is a native son, but we also have offices in New York, Denver, and LA. So we have grown over those 30 years, and we really focus on being a great business partner. That's really important to us. Managed services and IT services can be very transactional, and that's not how we approach it. So he really loves opportunities like this to talk to you about how to be better prepared, things that you can do as a small business, because we are also a small business, to really help kind of make yourself more secure, make it an easier and better way to tackle these challenges that come from cybersecurity, because those hackers are sneaky little guys. We also have probably the really big brain. I hope Dan will forgive me for saying that. We have Jim with us, and Jim is our specialist. He has all these letters behind his name, but that really kind of boils down to this. He's been part of the insurance industry for almost as long as we've been part of the IT industry. And he works as an educator. He does consulting. He's a broker, and he too has that same approach that Dan has of really trying to guide businesses to some good choices, let you know what you should know, answer questions, and really set you up for success. He regularly presents to audience, ranging from professional gatherings like this one to college and university courses. So he's really passionate about this, and we are so lucky to have him today. So I want you to put your thinking caps on, because you normally do not get access to this. So think of all those questions, and let's really make sure we take advantage of his expertise. So welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks, Jen, for a really nice intro. I'm glad.
I don't ever tell them what I'm going to say. I never tell them, because then they get all nervous. So,
and Dan, thanks for the invite.
So it kind of comes down to this. Why are we all here today? So cybersecurity awareness, it tells you something right there that is a whole month where we talk about cybersecurity awareness. And this is why, right? These guys never take a rest. There are so many reasons that we need to talk about cybersecurity. It was easy. They've been busy. Most of you probably heard MGM was hacked a couple weeks ago. And they literally shut them down. They locked their doors, they locked their guest rooms, they locked their elevators, they locked their slot machines. And they did all this through kind of a little bit of a sleight of hand when it came to calling for IT support. Caesars pretty quickly admitted the same hackers got them. The ID management company for both, which raises some questions, but we can talk about that in another webinar. So they actually had 5 of their customers that were attacked by the same hacking group. And that's just those 3, and that was literally in a week. Clorox has had a breach. They attacked their supply chain, and we see this even with our customers. Some of you may have noticed on social media, we had an alert just probably a week or 2 ago about a phishing scam that it looked like it came from a domain that looked like ours, and it said, hey, Authenticator is updating, you need to scan this code. So sometimes it's super simple, sometimes it's super complex, but they stay busy. And that's why we have to be here. We have to talk about these things, about kind of that cybersecurity stance. And I know that often we hear about these things and it's like corporations, right? It's MGM, it's some huge entity like Sony. But in all honesty, SMB is just as much of a target. I know, Dan, you talk to our customers all the time, and we see that within our own client community. They are targets.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And, let's face it, CNN and Fox News are not going to cover a breach at Joe's printing shop in Mendham, New Jersey, right? But because it's just not juicy enough. But the fact of the matter is that SMBs, small and medium-sized businesses, are absolutely positively targets. I can't stress that enough that, when the bad guys are hunting for vulnerable targets, they are indiscriminate, right? And so, many of our customers have stated, listen, we're probably a very unlikely target because of our size or because of our line of work. But trust me when I tell you, we've been doing this a long time, and that line of thinking is wrong. We have sat on the opposite side of the desk with a client, a grown man who was in tears when he absorbed the magnitude of the loss that he was looking at. And that loss includes financial loss, reputational loss, confidence loss with his vendors and suppliers. And that was before a bill of $250,000 to recreate an entire IT environment from scratch. So the bad guys know that small business is big business, and MGM is significant, but it's also a lot more complex and risky for them. They love easy, low-hanging fruit, and that low-hanging fruit are typically SMBs.
So
Having a little
Dan
Go
and
ahead.
Jen, as we have this conversation, I wanted to reflect on a LinkedIn post that I read this morning, which talked about just the infinite possibilities for attack surfaces as we use more and more devices. And unlike other types of risks that we insure for, the exponential growth of the risk is unprecedented. The other thing I wanted to comment on, Dan, when you had mentioned that the client you just spoke about was, it's scary to think that in a split second, all of your assets could be inaccessible or literally evaporate.
Yeah, yeah, it's big, it's messy, and no one wants to be there, including us on the remediation side. It's not the work we're looking to do for sure.
We were talking about this earlier, and I said, sometimes the disadvantage of virtual presentations is this last note down here, which is 2 out of 3 small businesses will have a breach of some sort in the next 12 months. If we were all together, I'd say, look to the people on the other side of you. That's a pretty high number. One of the 3 of you, are going to escape this, but the other 2 are gonna have this experience, and it may be something small, it may be something that's ID'd super quick, but sometimes these breaches go on for hundreds of days before anyone even realizes that they've infiltrated the system, and that's what's always kind of crazy to me. So
Absolutely.
that is why we are here. This is why we are going to pick Jim's brain. So let's kind of start with the basics, Jim. Like, I know you and I met because I did a blog about this, and I consider myself pretty well versed in tech, but there were all sorts of elements to this that I was surprised and thrilled to learn about, because it's a little bit different than what you think about regular insurance as. So I'm going to hand it over to you and let you kind of go and talk to our audience and share this with them.
Sure. And I think what I'd like to start with, Jen, is that cyber insurance it's a resource, right? Beyond just being a financial risk transfer, it's a resource. And when that cyber event occurs, it goes into play and provides things such as forensics, breach coaching, public relations, notifications, as well as liability coverage. So if we break down the policy, it's unique in that it's a single policy with a few interesting coverage parts. There's the first party coverage portions, which that's payment to you, right? Or for you as a business. And that's your forensic cost to figure out how did the breach happen. It's your notification cost if it's a data breach. It's the negotiations for the ransom, the extortion event. It could be it could even be some post-breach services which some insurers provide in limited amount to help you after the breach to maybe nail down things and make them a little bit better. For the folks who didn't follow all of Dan's instructions in the beginning, the
You
next
clearly
part.
have not attended any of our cybersecurity webinars. That's what they've done.
um, Another part of the policy is third-party liability. So we're all familiar with general liability insurance. We're familiar with auto liability insurance, where if we cause harm to another party, our insurance company will stand up and support us to defend us and, if necessary, compensate the other party. And cyber insurance works in the same way. And there's a number of portions or sections on the liability side of the coverage. There's your network security liability. If your systems are insecure and an attack is launched from your systems against clients. There's privacy liability. If customers' data is breached and those customers, beyond receiving some benefits like credit monitoring, which I think we all overlook at this point because it's so common, they could sue for real damages, and that's the data breach liability coverage. I will say, from speaking with our underwriters and from my own experience, we don't see a lot of liability claims at this point. Most of the claims fall into the first party bucket, right? The cleanup bucket, the let's get back in business bucket, right? Including business interruption. Depending on the insurer, some include this next coverage under the liability coverage portion. Others include it under the regulatory coverage section, or sorry, under the first party coverage section, but it's regulatory liability. And this is quite unique about cyber insurance in that it will pay fines and penalties for the violation of certain regulations. Now, those regulations are very specific. They're privacy regulations, which address how you collect data, how you delete data, how you manage data, how you communicate about that data. And it's typically personally identifiable information or personal health information, or even financially identifiable information. The policy will also cover some costs for the credit card companies if you are sued by them for certain types of missteps or violations. PCI DSS, we call that, payment card industry security. And then finally, for many businesses, an exposure that you don't think about too much is media liability, libel, slander, defamation. And that could occur just because of the information that you post on your website, right? You may not write all of your own copy. And to the extent that you use copy from others, you have potential media liability. Finally, and I have to tell you, in terms of frequency, for our clients at Phoenix Insurance Group, we've seen the greatest frequency under the crime coverage section. And the most common crimes, which we've seen, are two. There's social engineering, where an individual within an organization is tricked, typically by email, but it could happen certainly by text or by phone. But that individual is tricked to wire or send funds to a party outside of the organization, a criminal, who shouldn't be receiving those funds. We've had claims and amounts paid in excess of $400,000. It's kind of crazy. And the other type of event, and this type of event I'm going to mention next, is really only insurable on a cyber policy. It's invoice manipulation. Some underwriters may call it a person in the middle attack. There's different names for it, but essentially the invoice that's being sent from one party to another is captured somewhere between points, and the banking information, maybe even the payment amounts, are altered so that the funds go to the criminal's bank account and not to the correct party's account. Insurance companies are seeing mostly at this time ransomware attacks. They continue. Apparently 2023 was a banner year for ransomware attacks. It didn't go down, and these business email compromise schemes. But I would say that one of the best ways to frame cyber insurance is as a resource because of the services that are provided along with the coverage components.
So I have to ask a question. I'm sorry, Dan. I asked you this when we did our blog. Do you need all of these? Are these all separate? Do most businesses just need one type, or how do they approach that? It's a little hard to tell. If you do research online, it's a little hard to tell the difference.
Right. So most of the policies, especially for your small and medium-sized businesses, which, that accounts for businesses up to $250 million in revenue, sometimes a little bit more depending on, how you're qualifying them. But most businesses will get a package, which means a cyber policy that includes these three coverage components. And the rating on the components, it varies a little bit in that different industries are subject to different types of risks. But the policies really, it's hard for some underwriters to break them apart. But what you will see in some instances, and this is not true for every insurance company, you may be able to buy less first-party liability and more third-party liability. On the crime coverage side, those limits are pretty common, and they vary between $50,000 and $250,000. And for some industries, like the financial services industry, crime coverages may not even be offered to clients. I mean, I don't see it being offered in those industries. So that's one case, industry specific, where maybe you can only get the first party and the third party coverage parts without the crime coverage. I would like to touch on one thing. I just mentioned that some insurers will allow you to split limits. For instance, maybe you take $1 million of coverage across all the 8 or 10 first party coverage sections, and then you take a $5 million limit on the liability coverage side. Again, not every insurer will do that, but those that will, it can be useful because many times the liability coverage parts are required by contract. Right. So what we're seeing more frequently is businesses are buying cyber insurance for really two reasons. One, pure risk management and reputation protection. And the second reason, contractual compliance.
And I love how Jim just walks us right into that, Dan, because we had this conversation as part of our prep call. And we actually spent a lot of time on this because Jim and Dan were talking about how these conversations go when you sit down and Dan's talking to clients. They ask the question about cyber insurance, or we ask them, do you have it? Are you prepared? What are you thinking? And we kind of talk through that there's sometimes a requirement, but there's kind of this four-step conversation about, like, do you need it? And let's talk through your reasons. So maybe Dan, maybe you can kind of walk us through that. I thought this was really very interesting, and probably a conversation some of you've had with Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sitting here, and I was listening to Jim talk about the wire fraud schemes and the social engineering, where one of your employees probably this week or last week got an email that looked a little suspicious, was on the fringe. Is this legit or not? Um, what gets me emotional is that when I've seen these attacks occur, more often than not, they were 100% preventable by doing things that were not very expensive, were not very complex, but they were 100% preventable. Now, no solutions provider, Exigent, nor anybody else can create the silver bullet, absolutely 100% guarantee you're never going to get hacked or swindled. But most of the ones we've seen were 100% preventable. I know that wasn't part of this slide, but I get a little emotional thinking about it. But this slide, I think, is really important because it's funny. We've been doing this for nearly 3 decades, and it was fun back in the day because you weren't thinking about cybersecurity. Yeah, you had your little harmless viruses that would maybe corrupt your PC and you had to rebuild it. And it was more of a joke or a hoax. But today it's a criminal enterprise, and today I find myself every day being in the insulation business, right? Just trying to get my customers to listen and to put up insulation to reduce their attack surface. So what do you do with risk, right? In cybersecurity, we say you have 4 options, but I think this concept of what to do with risk applies to many areas, right? Some of you may like to go skydiving, others may choose not to. So it's perfectly fine to accept or transfer a risk if you've evaluated that risk, right, to your business and what the potential impact to your business is. And that's your tolerance level, right? And all of you on this call have a right to self-determination, right? You can avoid, you can transfer, you can mitigate, or you can accept that risk. But do so, my advice is to do so only after making sure you really understand it, right? More often than not, it's not a gut decision. You need to kind of put it in perspective. So let me give you an example. One customer is a manufacturer who identified a potential risk to a small manufacturing segment within their plant. So to mitigate that risk, they'd have to upgrade their entire system and all the hardware would have to be replaced. The current systems were older. They ran an outdated operating system, okay, which is a big no-no in the cybersecurity world. But except for the legacy operating system, the manufacturing platform was otherwise healthy and it's fully operational and no other dependencies or connections outside the plant. So the cost in order to do the upgrade is $150,000, and it would have required them to shut down that segment of the plant for a minimum of 2 weeks if they wanted to go forward with it. In this particular scenario with this particular customer, the risk was due to the availability of the manufacturing system. The equipment was old, so the risk was increased, but the likelihood of an outage was low and acceptable to this particular customer and their risk tolerance. The cost and effort of the remediation greatly exceeded those of an outage. And so they did a good evaluation and they made an educated, well thought out decision. Example 2, second customer was looking to implement an online payment processing system for their customers. Doing so would reduce overhead and increase sales by allowing customers to pay for purchases online with their credit and debit cards rather than picking up the phone and calling the order in. The company estimated that sales revenue would increase upwards of 65% using online payments, but then they'd be liable for something that Jim talked about, PCI compliance, right? Payment card industry. You got to store these credit cards and all this personal information, and they'd be processing that. The company consulted with IT professionals regarding the regulatory requirements and quickly determined that the risk could be transferred by outsourcing the payment processing to a third-party payment system like a Square, right? Visa, they have solutions for this. So they partnered with a payment solutions provider, which eliminated the credit card information from within their silo, within their environment. They increased sales by a whopping 78% in the first year. So as you can see from these scenarios, a properly executed risk management process is your friend. It's not a process that attempts to be 100% right? But rather to be 100% certain that the organization is aware of the risks. What's the downside? What's the upside? And that a balanced and actionable plan is in place to reduce the threat and the financial impact. So, we think that that conversation is important. If there are missing pieces in your cybersecurity hygiene, and some of these things are free, right? They don't have a cost. Others have very minimal cost, and in many times, just educating your workforce on what's going on out there and what to look out for is one of the cheapest yet most effective things that you can do. So hopefully that gives you a little guidance on what to do with the risk. Put them in these 4 categories and decide what your appetite for that risk is and decide what to do with it. Avoid, transfer, mitigate, or accept it. Finally, required. What does that mean? As some of you know, and Jim alluded to earlier, or Jen, or both of you, in some cases, you're going to be required to get cyber insurance if you want to do business with a certain customer. For example, my company, Exigent, has customers that require a minimum level of cyber liability insurance and other types of coverage if we want to do business with them. It's binary. If you want to do business with us, we're going to need you to have this coverage. And so that's what that required block is there. And some of you may or may not be in that situation, but I think going forward, you might be seeing more and more of those requirements.
I think you're just going to see exactly that. It's going to grow. Different kinds of businesses that have never had to deal with it might have to deal with it. So
yeah, and this is where the transfer comes into play, right? Today we're talking about insurance, and this is where well, we don't want to avoid it. We want to take credit cards, or we want to do this. How do we maybe transfer some of the risk? And that's what insurance is all about, right?
absolutely. So, Jim, I'm going to bring it back to you. We're going to talk a little bit about, making some of these decisions that Dan talked about. So you've gone through this and you've decided, nope, we want to make this investment. We want to protect this business. Maybe you could give us a few little tips on coverage, and how do you know how much? If anybody who owns a house knows that you go in and you talk to people, they're like, do you want this much coverage? You're like, I have no idea. Do I want that much coverage? It seems like a lot. But also a little bit about, providers, just as important with this as they are with other things.
Yep.
And maybe we'll talk a little bit about the renewal process, because this was definitely a learning point for me.
Sure. And if I could just roll it back to something that Dan said before we jump into this, in terms of contractual risk or in meeting insurance requirements as a condition of doing business. We're seeing that much more frequently for a lot of different reasons, and it's interesting to see how that evolved. And I'll break this down in 2 minutes. In the 80s, the architect and engineers insurance industry was falling apart. And it was falling apart because architects and engineers were accepting wild indemnifications that put them on the hook for many things. They began to get a control of this, and contracts became stronger. The construction industry, of course, is part of the architect and engineering industry, and following suit, their contracts continued to strengthen in terms of having risk transfers for any party that a general contractor was doing business with. So every sub of a sub, and everything just flows down in terms of transferring risk. And this became habit, and it made for a strong construction insurance industry. I would submit to you that that now attorneys and risk managers, with this awareness of how the A&E industry was changed and became more profitable on the insurance side and the construction industry, are very sensitive to implementing rather strong risk transfers. And those risk transfers only work if they're supported by a financial mechanism, right? Because most businesses don't have the cash flow to address an indemnification requirement. So insurance becomes part of the process. And now with businesses so concerned about cyber, the requirements for insurance are twofold. One, to lay off liability so we can subrogate downstream to the party who caused the risk. But also, two, if you think about it, making sure your supply chain partners have the right insurance. And on the cyber side, that includes first party cyber coverage, is really important in making sure they are resilient and stay in business should they be stricken by a cyber event. We know what happens when supply chains fail, and to a certain extent, when we can have a say in how our supply chains function and their level of resiliency, we do, and we require insurance. So having said that, getting back to cyber, boy, how do you know how much is right? I think it's almost impossible for me to answer that question, but you really need to understand your business, right? You need to understand how you generate revenue. You need to understand the assets and the technology assets that generate that revenue and get a sense of what happens when all of that stops. And in addition to that, you need to work with a group like Dan's and Exigent so that you have a level of resiliency, knowing that you're probably going to have a cyber hiccup. It may not be major, but it could be major. And if you have the major cyber hiccup, you need to know how you're going to be resilient and adapt and continue operations. So, the greater the resiliency, really the lower the limits you probably have to buy. However, there are probably those events, well, there are, that are unpredictable, and we cannot even imagine the extent. Now, many of those events which are unpredictable could be related to infrastructure, including power, including financial markets, including fuel systems. So those type of events are those are excluded from cyber policies, yet they do have an impact on technology, and you can't do this type of planning in a vacuum. In terms of building an insurance stack, I do want to mention that cyber risk is not just within the scope of cyber insurance. For medium-sized and larger organizations, we may need to evaluate cyber risk in terms of products that are produced and manufactured, in terms of directors and officers insurance programs, with respect to environmental coverage. Because, for example, let's say that your business has an environmental exposure, a pollution exposure. Maybe it's as simple as something related to HVAC and Legionnaire's disease because you own a lot of hotels or large office buildings. Well, I came across an environmental policy recently where the client declined terrorism coverage. And that's fine, except the terrorism coverage included electronic terrorism and manipulation as well. Meaning if those systems to that building were hacked and that caused some type of pollution event inside the building because HVAC systems weren't functioning, then that pollution event is excluded on the policy they were anticipating coverage. Folks don't know this because insurance policies they're a puzzle, right? They're a word puzzle, and they're all woven together differently. So it's really important to have somebody work with you who can tell you what pieces of the puzzle are working for you and which might be constraints that need to be changed or amended. I like to also talk to clients when we're evaluating cyber insurance for them in terms of, which insurer do you want to work with? Which insurer may be the best for your industry, the best for a particular company? Maybe overall, who are the top insurers and how do you even evaluate them? I mean, number one, you want to make sure the organization has financial stability. And that's pretty simple because you can go online to an organization like AM Best and see what the financial rating is. But digging a little deeper under the hood, I like to think about how did they get financially stable? And did they get financially stable because they're offering high quality coverage and they're underwriting very strictly to make sure that with this broad coverage, they're taking on insureds who are doing everything possible to avoid risk? Or do they have weaker policies and do a lot of volume where the coverage language may cause issues at claim time? Something to think about. I think overall the industry is quite strong, but you have to pay attention to these things. What about engagement? In the insurance industry, historically, we see companies coming in and out of certain markets. And we see in terms of insurance lingo, we see companies say buying market share. So they'll come into a market, maybe they'll have lower underwriting standards, lower premiums, and seek to gather lots of premium, and then they'll transition their business model, right? That's not necessarily the type of engagement I want from the underwriters I'm placing my clients with. I want companies that I know are interested in a market, they thought about it, they're offering the right coverage, and when the market goes sour or south or whatever term you want to use, they're there. Their premiums may go up, but they're not going to say, hey, we're getting rid of this product line. And we saw that early on in cyber. Claims handling is another interesting one. And while I am fond of different types of business models to provide cyber insurance, and I think the two current models, there's a third and a fourth model, but we'll focus on the two current models, is either an insure tech and a traditional insurance company. So your traditional insurance companies are your Travelers, Chubb, Hartford, Great American. Your insurtechs are Coalition, Corvus, Alpha Secure. Sorry if I got that wrong, if anybody from Alpha is on the phone. And there are a few others, Cowbell. And the difference is that the insurtechs are using often proprietary software and modeling to underwrite risks. There are humans involved, but they rely on their software to underwrite risk, and in some cases provide ongoing alerts and risk management services through their proprietary technology. It's a nice model, although I don't believe the majority of them have their own internal claims teams. Right, so I wonder sometimes if there's a large geographic event, how thin will some of the markets be stretched? Now, granted, the traditional markets also use outside services, but they do in many cases have robust internal services. And I bring that up because cyber insurance, as you saw in those different coverage components, really crosses property insurance, liability insurance, directors and officers insurance would be the regulatory component, and crime insurance. And within a traditional insurer, you have loss adjusters and claims team who have worked across those various lines. And I imagine, and I don't know this for sure, but if a worst case scenario event occurred, I believe that many of those traditional insurers may be able to rely on some of their internal resources to at least have boots on the ground or phone calls to comfort clients and start the process while they're waiting for their experts to be relieved, right? And have
Right.
some time. And then finally, commitment. How long have they been in the business? And we had some blips between 2019 and 2022. What did they do? What type of actions did they take towards their policyholders, towards underwriting, towards premiums, etc.
There's a definitely a lot to think about, and I mean you should with any insurance partner.
Yes.
I'm going to throw this quick question out. I want to make sure we get through all this. So, one of the interesting pieces we talked about was most insurance comes up due. They just send you a thing that says, "Hey, we're renewing your policy." You sign the check. Everybody goes happily on their way. This is a little different. Typically you like that ease of doing business, but in this case, you really want to look for someone who's going to hold you accountable as well, right? That's kind of a sign of a good partner, that every year we're going to take some time and we're going to go back. We're actually going to talk about the checklist in a minute, but we're going to go back and ask some questions about your environment and your policies and make sure that these things are being adjusted as quickly as the hackers are adjusting on the other end. So that's a little bit different, right? We want that somebody who says to you, "Hey, it's coming up for your renewal," just like we do as managed services providers. Let's sit down, let's have a QBR, let's have a PBR, let's talk this through. What has changed? What do we need to tweak? That's what you want with a cyber insurance partner, correct?
So I like the annual at the very least, and I'm talking to my clients way more than annually, but I like the annual renewal process that has a conversation, may have an application. Look, internally from Phoenix perspective, we certainly don't mind auto renewals. It's a lot less labor intensive, but I don't believe on the cyber side that auto renewals are always the best option. Now, to that point, there are certainly insurers who use tools other than a conversation and an application to gather data. And this is evolving. And there's a lot of questions as to whether or not an application is even the best way to underwrite cyber insurance. And I would say it depends on the risk, the size of the risk, who the MSP involved is. Do we know them? Do we know the quality of the service the MSP is providing? But I will say that this risk continues to evolve really quickly, and I think Dan can talk to that point, and including on the checklist and maybe how that's changed and how he thinks of things. But that's the reason I think that a deep conversation and or an application are really appropriate at renewal. And then you find things out during that process, which I like to maybe point out to clients, hey, you just said this. Well, have you thought about this?
Yep. And, again, you'd think that we had this conversation beforehand because here we are at cyber insurance checklist. So we've talked a lot about the insurance side of it, which I think is where a lot of us don't have much knowledge. But one element of this that's different, like I said, it's not like auto insurance. You don't drive your car in and they say, "Yeah, you want this? Sure, sign here, pay us. We don't care." This is about a lot of information gathering, and most of them require a checklist. They ask for a lot of information. And one of the things we talked about, Jim, was much like life insurance, you do not want to wait to get cyber insurance till something goes wrong, right? You can get insurance after a heart attack, but it's a lot more expensive. Same thing with cyber. You can get turned down for cyber insurance.
Yes.
So one of our takeaways from all this is be prepared. So take some time, again, like taxes, don't wait till the last minute. Take some time and really look at your environment, talk to, you know, a provider maybe on an informational level, talk to your MSP, because you're going to need to walk through and answer a lot of questions before this insurance provider is going to give you an answer. And I think that's something a lot of people don't see coming. And Dan, that's often where we come into the equation. Like, if, for those of you wondering why this is on our radar, this is why our support team, our service team, will get a call and say, we have to we're getting cyber insurance, or we're renewing our cyber insurance, and we have this pages and pages of things to go through.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about that tech side and being prepared of this.
Yeah, again, dating myself, but 10, 20 years ago it was unheard of. We didn't get calls from customers saying, I got this questionnaire. And the questionnaires are not just from cyber insurance providers, they're also from vendors, right? Hey, we're doing business with Amazon now, or Walmart, or just we're a government contractor, or one of our vendors or customers is asking us deep questions about how we handle our data and where the backups are and such. But yeah, we did go ahead and create the cyber insurance checklist because so many requests were coming in. And whether it's a cyber liability insurance provider asking the questions, or a vendor or someone in your supply chain, there's a lot of commonality between the questions they're asking, right? How do you handle backups? Are you doing security awareness training? I mean, so this is where we get injected into the process. Again, we don't sell insurance. We don't get compensated in any way when someone buys insurance. But whether you're renewing coverage or applying for coverage, or maybe you're a law firm that just landed a new client, that's asking for this. They have questions these days, and that's often where we get the call or email. And I don't think it surprises anyone that insurance companies don't like risky endeavors, right? They're in business to make money, and they're hoping that the odds are in their favor. And there's a reason they want a blood draw. If you're applying for a $2 million life insurance policy, I've applied for much less and had to have my blood drawn. So they're not in the business of taking super risky endeavors, and so they're going to want to make sure your house is in order. And yeah, that's where we're going to get the phone call. And preparation is everything, right? Jen said it. You don't want to have an incident and then say, hey, maybe we should get this cyber liability insurance, because they're going to ask you, right, Jim, if you've had an incident in the past. Just like they're going to ask you if you had maybe a DUI when you apply for car insurance.
Right. And Dan, it's funny you mentioned that, because early on in the cyber insurance underwriting process, if you had an incident, underwriters looked at you as maybe being a better organization. But now the awareness is, if you had one incident, then maybe there's something systemic within the organization that's likely to cause another incident.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think one of the things, for those of you who are on, you can actually look at this handout. It's attached to the cybersecurity list. We're gonna send it to you afterwards, but just to kind of give you an idea of what they look at, it's really a pretty broad range of questions they ask, and it's usually they're kind of segmented into sections, policies, budget, etc. But Dan, maybe you can just touch on this real quick and let people understand why they ask some of these questions. And if you look at this, you'll see why we say this is not something to do the night before, like the test, right? Like, do not wait until April 14th to start filling out your cyber insurance checklist if you're going in the next day, because it's going to take a little time and a little work.
It's true, yeah. I mean, so whether you have a policy today or you're thinking about maybe applying for a policy, you want to have your house in order. If you're a current customer of ours, we obviously know what you have and we can help you out with this. But the process of gathering information and implementing these items, if you don't have them, let's face it, everything takes time, right? To gather the information, to create a proposal for, let's say, I don't know, maybe you need some policy written or you need to straighten out your DNS. So we'd encourage everybody to get that process moving sooner rather than later. And look, even if you end up not buying cyber liability insurance at all, going through the exercise will certainly level up your cybersecurity hygiene, right? And so, what is not a good day is when a customer calls and says, "Hey, we just got a renewal letter from our insurance carrier, and they said they're not renewing us unless we have multi-factor authentication, for example, in place." And I know we kind of been putting this off, but now it's an emergency. Like they're not going to renew the policy, and my boss is going to, kick my butt. So waiting till the last minute, like with everything else, is not great. If you have a policy and they haven't ever asked you any questions, I could bet dollars for donuts they probably will be soon, right, Jim? If they haven't kind of checked up on you.
Oh my gosh, for sure. And we see that mostly with endorsements to property and liability policies, which, just a quick comment, if something's not underwritten, it's probably not that broad in scope or limits.
Yeah, and so some of these things you are going to speak for themselves, right? Do you have this kind of firewall and this and that? Many of you will check many of these boxes, but many of you are not providing cybersecurity awareness training, which is more common than ever that they're asking for that. Some of these things are technical. DNS, Dan, that's what we hire you for. I don't know anything about DNS. Earlier on, I suggested that a lot of the exploits and attacks and fraud that takes place are 100% preventable without a $10,000 or $100,000 fix. Many of these things are very easy, but it does require having a conversation. So frequently they're asking for more and more things, and certainly we can help you, a current customer, or if you're on the call and you're not currently a customer, we can help you through this process. And we offer we're going to talk about it, but we offer a free cybersecurity assessment. It's free and we didn't create it. It's a third party that's completely uninvolved.
It's
We had
great
no,
for this number two, this evaluate and understand your baseline. It's a
yeah,
fabulous opportunity for that.
yeah. So anybody who doesn't take advantage of an absolutely free, non-invasive assessment where we will not ask you for the administrator credentials. So we're truly going to see what we can do without you giving us administrator credentials. I think you're leaving money on the table. I think it's a great opportunity to get a baseline. And we offer that for current customers as well as prospective customers.
And we really try and communicate what we're telling you here. Like this, it can easily, you can get that sheet, you can open that PDF, you can look at all these pages and questions and think, oh, come on, seriously, people. But it's a great opportunity. Dan and I were joking, like, how many of us have policies and we go look at the policies and you're like, oh, look, this was dial-up when we wrote this. Like, not the same thing. It wasn't that long ago that these were not such that threat, that attack surface was not so broad. So we try and get people to think of this as an opportunity. Again, if you're not getting insurance, to just look and remind yourself, where are we at? Do we need to improve these policies? Do we need to look at our investment? Do we need to just do some housekeeping around this? And part of that also leads us to another thing. One of the great conversations that you two had when we were prepping for this was about, what actually happens when there's a breach. And I was fascinated by this because Dan said something. I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'm going to let him say it here. I told him he had to say it here. But, we talk a lot about incident response, right? So something happens, you have your incident response. In and of itself, that's a policy, and it's built on all these other pieces. And a lot of folks don't have that. So if that, remember that, look at either person on either side of you, two of the three are going to have a breach in the last 12 months. What happens in your business? Does your entire team know what to do? Do you know who to call? So I asked, Dan and Jim to kind of walk us really quickly through this. We want to leave some time at the end for questions, but there's lots of different elements of this, and it starts with that incident response. So you have that moment where you think, oh, this is not good. This is not good. Somebody scanned the QR code on that authenticator phishing scam, and now we're in trouble. Like what happens with all of this?
Yeah, for my part, I'll say that having an incident response plan is a best practice. We recommend that everyone have one, and it doesn't need to be a 50-page detailed document, though some of them may need to be, right? But it all depends, but there should be some type of incident response plan in place, and it's all governed by policy. Not having it in place, in my experience, creates chaos, automatic chaos. I'll give you a small, subtle example that you might not have considered. So you're going throughout the course of a normal day and everyone's working, and then suddenly something happens, someone gets a really scary message on their computer, maybe something stops working, things are not looking right, looks and smells like maybe a ransomware or the worst case scenario. Our phone rings, maybe we start doing some reconnaissance work to figure out what's going on, and then one of your employees picks up their handheld computer, otherwise known as the smartphone, and maybe goes and texts their husband or wife and says, I think we just got hacked. And or maybe they go on Twitter or Facebook and say, yeah, I'm sitting here, none of us can work, we're under attack, or all of our systems are down, right? Maybe it wasn't a breach or an attack at all, right? But do you have a policy in place that maybe trains your employees on how to deal with such a thing, right? Because we've seen instances where there's no incident response plan and very bad things happen. So that was a case where, you have a non-event, a non-breach, where maybe they call our help desk and we go, the internet was just down and that email you received, it was a coincidence, it was a hoax, right? Nothing to see here. But now on social media, so-and-so company has been hacked. Not good, right?
Your PR
On the
person
other
will
hand,
call you into her office, I can guarantee.
exactly. On the other hand, when it's a true tragedy of ransomware in progress, right? There are, I think almost all 50 states now have breach notification laws. You're required to notify law enforcement. If you have cyber liability insurance, that's usually the first call you make, right? First or second, it's way up there. Your policy might have language in it that tells you what to do. And it's a crime scene in most cases, right? And when someone gets shot at the 7-Eleven, what do? They put that yellow tape up, right? Stop. We have to control this scene. Many times, just rebooting a server that you may think has something wrong with it can lose you valuable evidence or even a chance at recovering that data. So I'll let Jim chime in on what happens when the bad event occurs. But from our standpoint, knowing what to do, having some semblance of direction in the case of the worst case scenario is very important.
Sure. And Dan, to your point, many underwriters want an incident response plan as part of the underwriting process because they recognize, one, that It will facilitate containing the event, whether it's a real cyber event that's causing real damage, or whether the internet went out, right? And you had that coincidental email that was sent. I do always recommend having the insurance company claim information in your paper, hard copy, incident response plan, disconnected, right? Papers air gapped. Have that information available, know who's going to call and make that report. Certainly, I'd say we're, the second call in most cases, right? Because it is a crime scene and you may have to let the FBI know and make them aware. Where I tend to get very involved is in advising clients as this event has been reported on, what data do you want to begin to collect as you make the claim? What are the extra expenses that are involved that, may be eligible for payment? Think about if you're having a business interruption and start calculating the losses related to that interruption. Also start to take some inventory in conjunction with the team that the insurance company put in place with regard to the equipment. Has some of that equipment been bricked? You'll need to set it aside and start to establish the values for that equipment. But my role is very much being there as much or as little as the client wants me to be there, including, advising, okay, well, now we had this event and all of a sudden we had this happen one time. One of our clients here in New Jersey, a manufacturer and a pharmaceutical company, showed up within a couple of days to understand what the event was because there was proprietary data that our client had. Thankfully, it wasn't breached, but there are so many different things that you might have to be dealing with. You want to keep as many professionals in play to the extent possible, right, without disclosing information that your breach coach and legal team say should be kind of at least held close to the vest during the initial process.
Thank
I
you,
think
Jim.
that communication piece is so big, as the Marcom person on the call here. Like, you think about, even, do you have copies of your customer list that aren't on a computer? Lots of us have those external tools. We use HubSpot, so I could always go in on a personal computer and access that. But if you have a CRM that's an on-premise instance, all of a sudden you can't even communicate to customer. There's a lot of moving parts for these, and much like the checklist, it's something you want to think through and build over time.
And
And I
hey,
know that.
could
Oh,
I interrupt
yes.
1 sec?
Mhm.
I think one thing that I didn't cover on the first party coverage, and you just kind of mentioned it, right, with HubSpot. Most of the cyber insurance policies, not only do they include first party business interruption or the business interruption that your business faces, but will also include, just like on a property insurance policy, coverage for dependent relationships where that vendor that you're working with, supplier, consultant, has been the one impacted by the cyber event. And coverage varies, and there are certainly restrictions for what we call large scale or systemic events, and that continues to evolve. But something to think about, that these dependencies can be insured.
Absolutely. So I know we're running a little out of time. I sent you guys a note. We're going to wrap up here pretty quickly. I appreciate it if you can spend a few more minutes with us. We kind of threw a lot at you today. This is why we're recording this, and we're going to share it with you because it's a whole lot of information to take in. But we kind of talked to the team and came up with sort of 3 key things that we just want to really make sure you walk away with. That idea of homework and prep. You know, do your checklists, get that assessment, think through your risk tolerance, get all these pieces together, talk to people before you go out and look for this insurance so you're prepared for it. Like, better to mitigate and close some of those gaps up first. Cyber resiliency. We talked to SonicWall a couple weeks ago for a cybersecurity, very specific on cybersecurity webinar, and our guest from there said, it's the idea of looking at your environment in 360 degrees, which touches on what Jim and Dan have said a lot, right? It's not just security products. It's not just employee training. It's not just cyber insurance. It's that idea of an incident response plan and the policies and the backup. It's great if you have your backup set up, but if you don't have an idea where you're going to put it when you're locked down, when that yellow tape is across the front of your business, either digitally or brick and mortar, that has to be that whole idea of how you're going to operate and how you're going to recover is a big picture, and that's something to think about. And then employee training, Dan we've been in the business a long time, and the very first line of defense are those folks that are often the ones that accidentally click the button. They see something that's off. We laugh internally. We have cybersecurity training, and I tell you, every single time, because they're spread out just enough, we all send our VP of tech a note that says, "Is this phishing?" And I said to him, like, it probably drives you up a wall, but aren't you glad we do it? He goes, "I will take 100 of those messages every day versus having one of you click on it," right? So it's really your first line of defense. So many of these things happen because someone just innocently takes one little step, and then the doors are open. So like I said, we are going to send you all of these things. You're going to get an email from us that has the checklist. It's going to have a link to our blogs. There's several on there. There's some about USB and travel security and the checklist and cyber insurance. Jim helped us write a blog on that. Lots of cybersecurity information there. We didn't touch on this, but we talked about incident response. We actually have a vendor partner who does incident response. You buy incident response. So if you have a more complex environment and you just can't even imagine, they actually work with both the MSP, so say an Exigent, and their team, and they kind of pull everybody together. They take advantage of their expertise. They're a security vendor, and that's something. We'll send you a little in there information about that. And then also the link to get that free risk assessment. So we'll send all of that to you in a follow-up along with the recording and the slides. And I'm going to have Dan. I know we talked about this briefly, but this is what we're talking about with that third-party risk assessment, Dan. They
Yeah.
kind of run through all of this. Let me actually pull up the real life sneak peek. I think this is a better illustration of how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're short on time and over on time, but I'll be really quick on this. It's a third-party analysis. It is not designed by us, but we pay a lot of money to be able to do these assessments, and we're offering it to customers and prospective customers and partners and for free. And so no obligation. It takes very little time to do. It's not invasive, and we don't want the credentials. So this, if you're interested in answering the question, how hackable are we? We have the answer, and it's free in this third-party analysis. Just feel free to ask for one.
It's really a great opportunity. No strings attached. It really is just, it's great for us. We learn something, you learn something. We really help everybody stay a little safer. If you have a question, we have just a couple quick questions in here, but if you have a question, take a few minutes, type it in there, and we'll try and get that answered. Even if you can't stay, obviously it'll be in the recording for you. So couple quick questions we have. I always have to write these down because there's too many moving things on my screen, which probably tells you exactly how old I am. So this is a question for you, Jim. Have you seen claims denied? And if they are, what's typically the reason? That's probably a big question. Maybe we can do kind of a short answer on it.
Sure. I only saw one claim denied at our agency, and it was denied because the client didn't follow an incident response plan. Very interesting scenario, right? The CEO's daughter is getting married. A ransomware event occurs on the Saturday morning when some people are working. Nobody wants to tell the CEO. They engage service providers and try to handle it themselves. They call the insurance company on Monday to report the claim. The insurance company gives them guidance, which, because they've enlisted the services of these other providers, they didn't follow. It wasn't my client specifically, but I was asked to jump in about 3 months later. And jumping in, we were able to get the insurance company to pay something on the claim, but it was a fraction of what the client was, could have had paid had they had an incident response plan, followed the incident response plan, and listened to the insurance company's guidelines after they reported the claim.
That's it.
Cannot leave the
Now,
incident
and
response
I
plan
should say
in the
one other
drawer.
thing. One other thing on denied claims. So have sold folks, businesses, cyber insurance because they came to find out that some of the other coverage they had, including professional liability insurance, where it included cyber coverage parts,
Mhm.
didn't have the right cyber coverage parts, and then help those clients and move them kind of over to Phoenix and put in the proper cyber insurance coverage, and then help them navigate rewriting the professional insurance so that everything was better synchronized.
Right. Here's a question, and I'm actually kind of curious about this myself. Do cyber insurance companies do their own investigations? So, on the movies, right, when somebody steals the shiny diamond, the usually very attractive insurance investigator is right on scene. But is that a real thing?
So on the cyber side, the industry does rely on a lot of experts, and then internally they'll manage the claim. I don't know. I don't know for sure if there's some companies that are managing everything from A to Z. I'm going to say those that I work with are not, because in this day and age, using independently contracted businesses where you can get expertise without having to build it internally, it's certainly an advantage.
And I would just think most of these hacks involve all the things we talked about, privacy laws, federal laws. These are typically a federal investigation. The end of the sentence on the great stories about all these is the FBI is handling the investigation, right? So it sort of makes sense that this is a bigger a piece to the puzzle. So here's one that will a policy cover cyber crimes from a nation state actor? So I'm assuming this person we're talking about, say a terrorist, if they hack in, and maybe as part of a bigger incident, is that something that would typically be covered in cyber insurance?
It's a wonderful question. And first, you have to think about attribution and whether or not you can attribute that event very specifically to a nation state. And many of these nation states are very good at cloaking where that attack came from, right? However, if we can truly attribute an attack to a nation state, it's going to depend on the insurance policy. And it's going to depend on whether the event was perpetrated against an individual client
Mhm.
or against the nation as a whole. So the London markets are currently excluding certain types of events, which they might consider cyber war, which impact a significant amount of the infrastructure of the target country.
Mm-hmm.
However, those endorsements have exceptions. We might call them a carve out, but an exception that if your operations are in a country that wasn't targeted and your country hasn't had the infrastructure damage, but you were impacted by the event, then there may be coverage under your policy. And I say may because these events are so unique, but
Right.
there is an exception for those businesses outside of the nation state that whose infrastructure was impacted. Now, when you do that, you also have to look at, and I guess we could do a really deep dive. I could spend 3 hours on this, but you know, sometimes when we work with large clients, we may recommend currently, and this is just currently, a US-based insurer, because some of the US-based insurers have more favorable to the insured cyber terrorism and war-related exclusions. Now, I imagine that will change because everybody will, these are events that it's like flood. You can't really insure flooding because, right? And you can insure war. They're catastrophic events. So we'll see changes on that topic.
Okay. Well, that's the questions we had, and I know we went a little over time, and most of our folks stuck with us. So thank you very much, and thank both of you, Jim and Dan. I know you put a lot of time and work in this, and it's been great working with you. And I'm sure our audience appreciates all of this information. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
All right. Well, we will see you all soon. We hope there's going to be a short survey when you leave the event, and you can watch for that email a little bit later today. And thank you for attending, and we hope we'll see you again soon.
Bye.